As always, we're grateful for your kind attention here. Who has a question this morning? Maybe some of you found more contrast than I was able to come up with between Nebuchadnezzar and Christ. I'm sure there are a lot more. Yeah.
You said that you believe that John was physically transferred to heaven, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so you believe then that heaven is a physical place, currently has a physical location, and that there is a physical throne where God, who doesn't have his physical location, is sitting on. So how does all that work in your view?
Yeah. Yeah, of course, the question being, God is a spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. So how does this work? Well, first of all, he's definitely not limited to that throne, if you will. And how does it actually work? I don't really know how it works. I think another reason why I believe he was actually physically in heaven is, and again, it's very difficult for me to put it all together, and people argue about it. We didn't turn to it, but Ezekiel sort of has Ezekiel 1:1. It sort of seems like a similar thing that happens with Ezekiel, though not quite as specific. Another reason why I didn't mention it, why I believe he was actually in heaven, and this brings us theological problems as well, because there's no sin in heaven, right? No sin. But later on in the book of Revelation, you might recall, we'll get there eventually, you might recall that John goes to worship an angel, right? Which would be a sinful thing. The angel stops him. But I think that's another indication that he was somehow physically in heaven, because it seems like he physically goes to actually physically bow down and worship the angel. So that's kind of like another reason, though the idea, I can't really break it down.
If you take the traditional view that angels are spirits, or pure spirit, then you run into problems even with saying that John was physically bowing down to an angel. That starts to not even make sense.
Go on, explain that.
Well, if an angel is a spirit, then you can't literally bow down to it.
Right.
But I don't know
Yeah.
what to believe about all this, but
Yeah.
you are saying you believe right now there's a physical heaven, perhaps not approachable by the spaceship, but it's physical, and this is actually a literal description, at least to some extent, of what that looks like.
I'm okay with it to some extent. I'm not even sure. Take hell, for example. Is hell physical? It has to be in some sort of a way, but I don't know exactly how. For example, does Lazarus and Abraham and the rich man, how does that all actually work? I'm not really sure. Was it really Abraham there? Some manifestation of Abraham? Water, we have water, we have flame going on there. We understand flame, we understand water. I don't think it's flame and water in the sense that we experience it. I don't think it was. So there's some sense going on here. This goes back to the difficulty I had in 1 Corinthians 15, you may recall, with the idea of the resurrection, which is a difficult thing, because you have the souls in heaven which seem to have a body. They're clothed in white somehow, but they haven't been resurrected yet. So how does it work? And I can't put the squeeze on the whole thing. I've worked on it, but I can't do it. But somebody else, yes.
Well, I mean, is part of this simply an issue of our ability to understand what the spiritual realm actually is? I mean, I would pose this question, which is actually the greater reality? This room and everything we see, or the spiritual realm, which is absolutely takes up space between you and I. Which is more real? And which is more rooted in the actual truth of creation and all of God's design? So I would argue that the limitations that we have in understanding a lot of these things have way more to do with what we perceive to be the ultimate realities all around us. And yet I think are only a fraction of what the reality is. I mean, from a scientific standpoint, for instance, let's take Jesus when he comes after resurrection, and he comes and visits the disciples locked in a room, okay? They're in a six-sided cube, right? Yet, most scientists will admit, if that actually happens, Jesus is working in at least 11 dimensions at the exact same time, from a scientific standpoint. So, the reality is that we don't even comprehend what that even means. So when we say, like, he's spirit, or or a spiritual body, we intellectually can begin to understand what that should look like, but we really have very little comprehension of how that actually functions. So I don't think that we should be too worried when we see things like, is heaven a real place? Absolutely. Is hell a real place? Absolutely. Are they real in the sense that we experience real? To us, real is I can get in my car and drive there, walk inside, look around, and then go home. That to us is real, but have we really experienced that place that we just went to? Not in the same way that we do in a spiritual sense. I mean, what does it mean? What does music look like? What does music really sound and taste like? These are all things that I think we have very little understanding of. So I just think we should, they're good questions to ask, but I think we should understand our limitations in even being able to ask the question itself. We don't even totally know what to ask about those realities.
Yeah, it's a difficult challenge, and the idea of Christ, like, him walking into the room past all the doors, and they weren't, at this point they were scared stiff, so they weren't slack about locking the doors. No one was getting in there by accident, that's for sure. And yet he says you have something to eat. So
Physical body, yet he just
Right.
walked into a six-sided cube.
Yeah.
How that even, I mean,
yeah,
how do you do that?
yeah, he breathes on them, and
Right.
it's yeah, but it's yeah. Dave.
So, we have Matthew 24 describing the destruction of the temple, the destruction of Jerusalem. Why do we need Revelation on top of that?
Yeah, I think there's two functions for Revelation and Matthew. I think the Matthew 24 discourse is a message, for the most part, of judgment and encouragement to those who are going to see Jerusalem, for example, surrounded by armies, and what they have to do about it. I think what happens is Revelation more than is Matthew 24 is a picture of what's happening on earth. Revelation, I believe, is a picture of what's happening on earth as a result of what's actively happening in heaven. And I think what's happening here is the devastation that happens when the temple got destroyed and the Jewish era, shall we say, came to an end, if you will. I don't think they could even comprehend from Matthew 24 just how horrible it's going to be. I think that gap is filled in Revelation. And certainly, what Matthew 24 doesn't make clear, that Revelation, I believe, does, especially around Revelation 12, is that there will be no protection at all from the civil authorities, which they were used to having up until Nero, for the most part. And so what happens is I believe that Matthew 24 begins the discussion, shows them what to do. I think Revelation tells them just how horrible it's going to be. And they have to understand that there's a God who is not scrambling. You got to remember, we do a good job, I think, of teaching our children. I know I was taught, God knows everything. God is all powerful, with the omnis, if you will. But I really believe with the converts that these people had, and the idea of the gods that they had, they were just used to ideas of gods that were like them, that had limitations. And if you believe in a God of limitations, Revelation is the book to deliver you from that particular wrong idea, if you will. And if the book of Revelation does anything, I believe it does that. And I believe that's one of the reasons why it was so necessary. The idea of a God without limitations was, I mean, to us, it's not. But to them, all their gods had limitations. That's why they needed so many of them, because they all had limitations. Good questions. Yeah, the more limitations your God has, the more you need. Simple math. Yes.
Well, in Revelation 1:10, it says that he was in the Spirit, and then also in 4:2, that at once he was in the Spirit, right? Capital S. So there was a transformation, not physical, but the Spirit was in the Spirit at that time. So, and God was revealing this. So I think Conrad's question is physical, like to us, it's not, but what Seth was saying, like Jesus walked through a wall. So I think there is another dimension to it that God can reveal it when he wants to.
Yeah, I'm happy saying that I don't understand it, because I don't. It is beyond our comprehension. God is not limited, although we do have him limiting himself. Is what's happening in heaven on the throne an idea of him limiting himself? It could be. I can't say for sure. But I am quite happy saying, I mean, there's so many things we just don't understand. Little things like Christ dies, right? And people come out of graves and they're walking around talking. And this is to me an amazing, I think a terrific example of the authority and the inspiration of Scripture. If that happened with us, we'd be writing volumes of encyclopedias on this. And it's just like barely a mention in the Gospels. People that were dead came out and they talked with us, and we don't know what happened afterwards or whatever. Another thing we just look at and we say, what happened there? What was that about? I get Christ dying, sort of. I get the place being dark, a storm, people coming out of graves and talking. I don't really have a whole lot to add to it. I don't have a sermon on that prepared, on what really happened. These are good questions. There are glimpses throughout the Bible that just take us beyond what we can feel we can, at least I can understand. At least I can. Bible reveals God, and it points, it's God coming down and talking to us so that we can understand. There are points where it's going to come through that we're going to really wrestle with it. Really, really wrestle. Good questions, good points. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, you'll think of your question. I think what we're wrestling with here is I was in a meeting. I don't know if I mentioned this or not. I was in a meeting of some other brethren who were, some were Baptist and some were Presbyterian. And one of the men said, hey, you know what, we don't have all of our theology together. This guy was Presbyterian that was saying this. He was saying, hey, we just don't have none of us have all our theology together. We don't have it all figured out. And of course I had to make the case. I said, well, we know we Baptists don't have it all figured out, because if we did, we'd be Presbyterian. And the Presbyterians said amen to that one. They did indeed. In any case, thank you for your kind attention here this morning.